Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to World War I, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Osceola County Teaching American History Project and America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, Vice President for Education Programs, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. I want to welcome back to our seminars all our friends from Osceola. We're going to get underway very quickly tonight. Let me just remind you that to find out about all the programs and resources that the National Humanities Centers offers teachers, you can go to americainclass.org. That'll take you to this page, and from this page you can get to all of the resources and programs that we offer. You might want to check out our spring seminar lineup. We just put it up recently. We offer some really interesting seminars, and we urge you to sign up for them. A reminder that after the seminar you can go to the World War I website, the website from which you obtained the readings for this evening's seminar, and there you will find a recording of the program, the PowerPoint, and the evaluation. Feel free to plunder the PowerPoint for your classes. The material is there for you to use, and as always I remind you to complete the evaluation form, submit it to us online. They're very important to us, and once we've received that, we will send you a letter that you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit this seminar warrants. Now, we had a pretty good discussion on the forum. I distilled it down into 4 questions, and we'll be considering these this evening. What was the political atmosphere and societal concerns that led to our involvement in World War I? Who were the key players and events in the first Red Scare? What was the effect of Wilson's policy of neutrality both on the home front and on the conduct of the war? Had we gotten into the war earlier, would it have ended sooner? And was the U.S. ill-prepared for the war when it entered the conflict? To lead us through those and other questions, we're very pleased to have with us this evening Ernest Freeberg, Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Ernie is an expert in American culture, social and religious history with an emphasis on the 19th and early 20th century. He's written widely on those periods. We couldn't put all of his publications on this slide. We have 2 of them there. So now let me turn the program over to Ernie, who will tell us all about World War I. Ernie, it is all yours. Take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. This is one of my favorite topics. I teach a course on the impact of war on democracy. A number of you have asked questions about how do you make this war relevant to your students, and I can relate to that. But I'm hoping I'm going to be able to share with you tonight some issues that resonate beyond the time period down to our own day, and raise some really fundamental sort of moral questions about the impact of war on democracy that I think I've found that students are very interested in trying to respond to. So let's dive into that. Basically, you asked some great questions, and I hope to cover as many of those as possible. The structure that I have planned for tonight is first to do a brief introduction about the causes of World War I, a complicated story, but one that I think we need to help students get a grasp on before we can proceed to ask some of these other questions. Secondly, why did the United States work so hard to stay out of the war? And why suddenly in 1917, toward the end of the war, did the country reverse course and commit to this global conflict? What were the goals for that, and how did the process of fighting this war affect Americans on the home front? I think the most important way to think about that is that this is a war waged, as far as Wilson was concerned, and the United States in general, was that this was a war being fought for progressive ideals. Famously, we tell our students, we cite Wilson's comments about fighting to make the world safe for democracy. So I think this is a nice way to talk to students about just what progressivism is. It's a slippery topic, and how the war both represents an expression of progressive ideals, and also many would suggest that the death of progressivism, the end of the progressive period, and the beginning of the conservative 1920s. So let's start by quickly running through the causes of the war. I always start with students by telling them about European imperialism. It's often said that the sun never set on the British Empire in this period. and Germany is emerging at that point as a rival for colonial power around the world, a scramble for African colonies and colonies in Asia. And as a result of this, you have the emergence of two rival superpowers, both of them expecting a war at some point down the road. People did not anticipate just how devastating and all-encompassing that war would be, but the war had been expected for some time. In anticipation of that, Germany sought allies to prepare for this in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in Turkey, as you can see on the map, the Ottoman Empire. And the Allies, the English allied with France, Russia, and Italy. Now, the spark that finally caused the war, it was struck in the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was something like, in our own time, we might think of the former Soviet Union a bit this way. It was an empire that was trying to control many rival ethnic groups that were pushing back and trying to establish their independence. So in June of 1914, the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Ferdinand, is visiting Sarajevo, and he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. And this sets off the chain reaction of these alliances. Austria looks to punish Serbia, but Serbia was in an alliance with the Russians. So Germany had pledged to support Austria, so they declared war on Russia. England and France pledged to an alliance with Russia, so they declare war on Germany. The point here is that many Americans drew at the time was that this is a small conflict that became a big one because of these entangling alliances. And this seemed a case study for Americans who had been warned by George Washington in his farewell address not to be involved in entangling alliances. This seemed a perfect example of why that was a bad idea. Here, this tiny incident had escalated into a war that everybody knew was coming, but everybody dreaded. Now, the German military, as I said, had been expecting this war to come for some time, and they had a plan. In August 1914, they tried for a quick knockout victory by skirting around the heavily fortified border with France, and instead going through Belgium, which was a neutral territory. Now, this was an excellent military strategy and almost worked, but it was a public relations disaster for Germany. The Belgian resistance, as the Germans are marching through, slowed down the German advance just long enough to allow the French and the British to react and to stop the attack in northern France, where that set up, as you know, four years of trench warfare. But it also enabled the British to portray the Germans as violators of international law and, in fact, as terrible criminals. First thing the British did when the war broke out was to cut the cable that connected the mainland of Europe with the United States, so that all information that about the war that came to the United States had to pass through a cable in England. And the British proved to be masters at propaganda and began to sell this idea that Belgium had been raped, the rape of Belgium, spreading atrocity stories. It was a terrible conflict. There were a number of civilian casualties and some bad behavior, but the British managed to sell this with some false atrocity stories to sort of win sympathy in the United States. Now, as the trench warfare settles in, both sides need to keep millions of soldiers on this massive front across Western Europe, as we see it here. And it's this stalemate and the huge destruction of this war, this mechanized war, that led each side to be dependent on supplies from overseas. In the end, that's what brings the United States into the war, is that both sides in the conflict need support from America and American markets. And this is a great opportunity for Americans to sell their goods, but it also draws Americans into the war. But at the start, Americans are trying to stay neutral, 1914 to 1917. Wilson calls on all Americans to remain neutral in thought and deed.
Ernie, if I could just interrupt for a moment.
Sure.
What was the object of the trench warfare? You know, it's always portrayed people going over the top, taking a few yards of territory, and then being pushed back. What was ultimately the strategy? What were they actually trying to do in those trenches and fighting that way?
Well, they were there really because the mechanization, the machines of killing had become so sophisticated and so powerful that was the only way to survive on the battlefield, was to dig in. So it was really a function. Both sides took a long time to react to the presence of machine guns and gas and to some extent airplanes at this point. So they're essentially digging in. Anytime they did try this sort of traditional above ground cavalry maneuvers, it was a disaster. So it's not really the sense that this was a strictly good strategy. It was essentially survival. Does that make sense?
I think so. So their object was really to take territory, to leap over the ramparts and push the other side back and claim their trench and move ahead that way.
That's right. But ultimately, that was a war of attrition. It was a matter of who was going to collapse first in that situation. There was no opportunity. As over 4 years, in spite of lots of attempts, the attempt to try tanks and massive bombardments to soften up lines, but the defensive strategies were so effective that there was just no way to overcome that. And so both sides really had to rely on trying to exhaust the resources of the other.
Okay, so it was a war of attrition. Thank you.
Sure. So Wilson, as I said, was urging the country to stay out of this. He even urged neutrality at the movie theaters. He said, when Americans went off to see the newsreels, to refrain in the movie theaters from cheering for one side or the other in order to stir up passions. And here you can see Wilson trying to lay out what neutrality is all about. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. And he's concerned here about Americans' love of their country, their loyalty to their government should unite Americans bound in honor and affection to think first of her and her interests. But in a country full of immigrants, Wilson's worried that without that neutrality, the country might become divided camps of hostile opinion hot against each other, involved in the war itself in impulse and opinion, if not in action. So really, you can hear Wilson pleading with the country to stay neutral, not just in its actions, but in its thinking. And I think this is a nice thing to share with students. Secondly, because that's the anxiety about neutrality. But here's a vision that Wilson also offers the country. Such divisions amongst us would be fatal to our peace of mind and might seriously stand in the way of the proper performance of our duty as the one great nation at peace, the one people holding itself ready to play an impartial mediation and speak the counsels of peace and accommodation, not as a partisan, but as a friend. So Wilson here is offering a vision of America, not simply as not involved, but rather using its neutrality in a very high-minded way. We see this is, I think, nicely encapsulates both sides of this. America's anxiety about the impact of war on its ethnic society, ethnic conflicts, as well as its emerging sense of having a particular destiny in the world.
We have a question here.
Yeah.
How much of a role do you think the military-industrial complex of the day played in Wilson's neutrality decision? Did they want to trade with both sides, or is that an issue you're going to pick up later on?
That is. That's an essential question, and let's please raise that again if I don't properly address it once we get through a bit more. Because
okay.
I think that's very
key question. So we have another question here too. You mentioned how America was a nation of immigrants, and Wilson was worried about setting immigrants against each other. How much was this because of the German population in the United States? To what extent was how much of a German immigrant influence did we have in the United States at this time?
A very, very large one. That is, I don't have the exact numbers, but it is the largest non-Anglo immigrant group in the country at this point. And Americans of immigrant background are deeply conflicted by this war, as Wilson's pointing out. A third of Americans were either immigrants or had immigrant parents. And I think there were about 8 million German Americans in the country. So they clearly had a side in this fight. On the other side, there were the Irish, another very large group, and they wanted nothing to do with anything that might help the British. They were involved in their own struggles for their own independence against the British. Another important ethnic group is the Jews, who were not at all interested in being allies with the Tsar. Many of them had ended up in the United States because they were fleeing pogroms in Russia. So all of these allegiances, these sort of divided loyalties, as Wilson would put it, make neutrality very fragile in the country. Americans were already concerned before the war broke out about whether or not these immigrants were really loyal to the country, and had launched a number of initiatives either to Americanize immigrants or else the beginnings of the discussion about closing that golden door and keeping some of these immigrants out. And the war put a lot of stress on that in ways that I think will be clearer as we go on.
So the presence of all these immigrant groups brought the old historical tensions of the old world to the new world.
Yes, well, yes, absolutely. And I guess it's important to remember those tensions were there already in 1914. This was a major concern for the country before the war broke out, and the war was only likely to make that worse.
Okay, well, shall we go ahead?
Okay, so the war drags on, and the U.S. is drawn in spite of this neutrality. And so let's think about why it is that Wilson changed course in the spring of 1917 and went ahead and got involved in the war. And the most immediate and obvious reason that we talk to students about is the German use of submarine warfare, which links us to this good question about the military supplies and trade and so forth. As I said, both sides in this global conflict are trying to wear down the other, and both sides are absolutely dependent on the possibility of getting loans and war material and food and all materials essentially from elsewhere. Their economies themselves are geared entirely for the war, and they need support. It's a matter of survival for both sides by 1917. International law had said that unarmed neutral ships are allowed to go to either side of the conflict as long as they're carrying non-military goods, non-military supplies, so food, clothing, that sort of thing, should be able to go to either side. And ships, the rule was that countries at war, their ships could stop neutral shipping on the seas, fire a shot over their bow, and search them. If they were carrying military supplies, they could take the passengers off and then sink the ship, or take the ship to their own port. But they had to give a warning to the passengers before they did this. There were certain rules about how this was done. But the problem was that England absolutely controlled the seas with a navy twice as big as Germany's, and Germany essentially never was able to take its navy out of port for fear of being wiped out by the British Navy. So the British, in order to deprive the Germans of the Central Powers of American supplies, they set up a blockade. They mined the North Sea and forced all ships that they could catch to come into England for inspection. And this was a violation of American rights. Americans complained about this, but there was no loss of life, and the British basically said, we'll pay for anything we take. Put it on our tab. We'll pay you after the war. And this managed to put enormous pressure on the Germans. They were suffering by 1917 bread riots, starvation, and so forth. The only tool that the Germans had to fight back against this blockade was the submarine. And this is the problem that this new technology makes all of these old rules about how you enforce neutrality obsolete. These subs were very small and very vulnerable, and the only way that they could attack was to attack without warning. So in 1915, Germany declares war on all English merchant vessels, and it warns neutrals like the United States to stay out of British waters, essentially denying the Americans the rights of neutral shipping. Wilson protests against this, and the Germans at first back down. The incident comes to a head with the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. And here the Germans had warned Americans by running notices in the newspapers, warning them not to get on the Lusitania because they intended to sink it. And their claim was that there were, while it was a passenger ship, that there were military supplies on there, which turned out to be true. The British denied this. The ship sailed. The Germans did sink it with a large loss of life, and this outrages Americans as a violation of neutral rights, and also an example of just the sort of atrocities built into this new total form of war. Germans, after Wilson's protest, agree that they'll stop doing this for fear of driving the United States into the war. And that continues for a while, but then they, in 1916, sink a French ferry boat. More civilians going down the Sussex was sunk. Again, Wilson threatens retaliation. And here you can see Wilson trying to work out essentially whether or not this, this is something that is possible. The submarine warfare is reconcilable with the laws of humanity. And I think it's interesting to talk with students in this case about what are the rules of law of war, and in a total war like this. I think in the 20th century we've seen enough examples of no holds barred destruction against civilian populations that it might be hard for us to imagine how the shock that this generated at the time. And I think it's an important moment to get students to pause and think about it. And I think a careful reading of Wilson's, the abstract doctrines about neutral shipping can be a bit dry, the international rights of shipping, but this fundamental question about the rights of neutral parties is a very basic and important one to talk to students about. Wilson manages to get the Germans to back down, and in 1916 he's up for election and he runs as the peace candidate on the slogan that he kept us out of war. He had, as you see here, he had defended America's interests, peace with honor, and he had also begun preparedness, which means that the country had in fact started to prepare for war, but very, very slowly. By 1916, there is a sense that, well, maybe the war is inevitable, in spite of Wilson being the peace candidate. He's also hedging his bets by beginning an arms buildup. And meanwhile, the war has proven to be pretty good business for the United States, selling. So the peace with honor, preparedness, and prosperity are all signals for students, I think, that you can talk a little bit about what's going on in 1916. Wilson says, so far as I can remember, this is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war. The country still, in spite of the provocations of Lusitania, is still clearly interested in not getting involved in the war in 1916. And Wilson is the peace candidate. He comes to office again in 1916. He once again makes this offer in early 1917 to be the mediator for peace without victory. and the possibility. He presents a vision of creating a new world order, an international order in the League of Nations after the war. Neither side is interested at that point in taking up his offer. And in fact, in early 1917, as Wilson is saying these things, Germany is making plans to escalate the war in a way that makes it inevitable that the United States will join. In early 1917, Germany was winning the war, but they were suffering enormously and knew that they couldn't hold out much longer. On the Eastern Front, they were also fighting against Russia. The Russian Revolution means that the Tsar's Russia collapsed. The Bolsheviks ultimately take over, and they sue for peace and quit the war. So the Germans realized that they can now fight a one-front war. They can pull all of their divided forces off of the Eastern Front, put them on the Western Front, and make one big, desperate last push to try to end the war. Their gamble is this: that they can win quickly before the United States gets in. But in order to do that, they decided that it's worth the risk to provoke the United States to war. One way they do that is by starting up submarine warfare again. They sink 3 unarmed American freighters. Wilson protests once again. And at the same time, the British intercept a telegram, the Zimmermann telegram, sent by the German Foreign Secretary, which was a secret deal offered to Mexico that if the United States declared war on Germany, that Mexico might go in as an ally of the Germans to try to recover the lost territory that they had lost during the Mexican War. It's under these circumstances, the provocation of submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, that Wilson recognizes that it's inevitable to go to war. And here's what he says. It's a beautiful long speech, and this is the very elegant end of this. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free. Wilson is saying the United States is not going into war to get revenge because of the sinking of these ships, because of the backstabbing of the Zimmermann telegram. And Wilson in this speech also says, we're not going to war against the German people. What we're doing is going to war against German tyranny, against the German leadership, the military autocracy. And here's where he suggests this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. This is the beginning of a program that Wilson lays out that ultimately results in the 14 points and its proposal for a League of Nations. The idea here is that the United States is going to fight not for plunder, not because it wants violence, but rather as a way, as we said, the war to end all wars. And here, I think we want to talk to students about Wilson as a progressive reformer and about his great ideals and how progressivism can go to war. So let me share some views of some other progressives who have pushed back, and then we can talk a little bit about what progressivism actually is.
Okay, Ernie,
yes.
Ernie, before we get to that, we have a number of questions here about the Zimmermann telegram.
Yeah.
How much did Mexico really consider the proposal, and would Mexico have been a threat to the United States?
Well, it seems that the Mexicans did themselves examine the possibility about whether, what would be the result if they were to go to war against the United States, and they concluded that would not go well for them, that they would have no chance. Mexico itself was in the middle of a revolution So it was you know, even if it wasn't, this is the time during Pancho Villa and the conflicts over the control of Mexico. So really, it was never considered or acted upon, and the Mexican government never responded to this. It was intercepted by the British, and they hesitated to turn it over to the United States because they didn't want to give away the fact that they were intercepting German messages. But in the end, they decided this was just too good not to let the Americans know about, and it did have the right effect. It outraged Americans, convinced them that the Germans were the right enemy in this war.
Mm-hmm. Did the Germans expect the Zimmermann telegram to be intercepted by the Americans, or to finally reach the Americans? They did not.
No. Nope. Not that I've ever heard. No, that doesn't. Zimmermann resigned when this was exposed, stepped down as foreign secretary, and the Germans were probably expected that the United States was going to enter the war one way or the other. So but they didn't have any particular need to try to break, to encourage that, accelerate that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then shall we get on?
Okay, the progressives. Here we hear the voice of another leading progressive who takes a very, very different view of whether or not this is the right war, whether the United States should be involved in war. Here, La Follette turns this argument on its head. Wilson had said this is a war that the German people don't want. It's the German government that's bringing the country to war. And we're going to fight against the German government and restore the German people to democracy. La Follette says, actually, the German people are probably more enthusiastic about their war than the American people are about getting involved. And if it wasn't, if the American people really were excited about this war, then it wouldn't be necessary to do these things that we're about to talk about, the espionage, conscription, and other sort of forcible military measures. The country wouldn't have to be forced to go into war if it was truly enthusiastic about it. So Wilson is arguing that the country is fighting for high-minded, principled purposes, and in a sense to project American values onto the European conflict and ultimately onto the world, and calls this a people's war. But La Follette delivers a powerful dissenting speech in refusing to vote for war and making the progressive case against war. Another progressive who considered this to be a terrible idea is Randolph Thorn, and he is sort of the patron saint ever since of anti-war voices, and he himself was a progressive intellectual, and he's shocked to find that many of his people like Wilson, who claim to be pacifists and peace-loving, are taking the country to war. And that he makes the argument, and this is worth exploring with the students, I think, that essentially it's not possible once you go to war to fight a war for high-minded purposes. If it's a question of controlling war, it's difficult to see how the child on the back of a mad elephant is to be any more effective in stopping the beast than is the child who tries to stop him from the ground. Here, Bourne is suggesting, that progressives think they're going to be able to fight a war with high-minded ideals, but ultimately, once war gets unleashed, it's a mad elephant, and it will go in directions that one can't control. So most progressives rejected that argument. They rejected La Follette and they rejected Bourne, and they suggested that Wilson was right and that it was possible to fight a war along progressive lines. So we should pause, I think, and help students think a little bit about what progressivism is, and it's complicated. I mean, historians have quite a cottage industry in trying to interpret just what this means, because it can mean many different things. But here are some of the things that I suggest to students that progressives share in common. One is that they are great believers in rationality, in the possibility that affairs can be resolved through reason, through science, through experts, rather than through the jostling of selfish private interests and superstitions and traditions. In this sense, they're along the lines of what we would think of as the Enlightenment thinkers of an earlier age, trying to bring reason to bear. They also have an enormous faith. They are the builders of our great university system, adopting a lot of it actually from the German model. And as a result, they have great faith in expertise, in university training, in putting people in charge who can make the right decision based on reason rather than on private interest. Even as here's what's so confusing, even though they are great believers in expertise and in experts, they also are great believers in democracy. And they are the ones who advocated the expansion of public education into high schools and promoting the press as a way to advance public interest, and a great believer in publicity. Their argument was that democracy needs to be purified. So they pushed for initiative and referendum, for the direct election of senators, and so forth. And they believe that ultimately, if the people are given valid information delivered by high-minded experts, that citizens will vote properly. And in this sense, their hope that the war itself can be fought along those lines. So let's trace a little bit how that actually worked. This was an incredible opportunity for these progressives to do what they had hoped to do, which was to bring the power of expertise to shape the federal government. So they, in the name of war, they take control of key industries. They force labor and capital to sit down together and rather than having strikes to resolve their differences for the time being. They issue a heavy war income tax in order to raise funds for this, and they develop a national draft, which they consider to be the fairest way to raise this massive army that they need to raise. So the war gives these progressives a chance for unprecedented power to control the economy. Along the lines of publicity, it also gave them the power to control public opinion. And here's where I think that the plot really gets thickens. When I talk to students about what goes on here, I try to break this down into two categories: expression and repression. Expression meaning that the government essentially takes control of what's being said, and repression is the attempt to silence critical voices, people like Robert La Follette and Randolph Thorn. So let's start with repression. This a committee on information was a journalist who was put into propaganda effort to move the country. Remember that the country was still divided. The country voted for a president.
Ernie, we're having some sound issues. Let me see just a moment here. There's not a whole lot I can do at this end.
It seems like you're clearer now.
Okay, yeah, I think it's come back. Okay, it's sunspots or something here in the middle of the night. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think we're okay now, so let's proceed.
Good, thanks. So I was talking about George Creel. I'm not sure when this started to go bad, but he was essentially a progressive journalist who is in a position to wage this massive effort to shape public opinion. And public opinion needed shaping because the country was deeply divided about this war. In spite of Wilson's very high-minded and stirring rhetoric, the country still was very unsure about whether it wanted to go to war. So it was Creel's job to change their mind. He hired 150,000 of the leading artists, writers, professors, teachers, filmmakers, and together they churned out 75 million pieces of literature denouncing the Germans and glorifying Wilson and the Allied cause. They also created films promoting patriotism and denouncing the Hun, And the U.S. government got directly into the news business. News from the front was tightly censored, but the U.S. government issued 6,000 press releases to newspapers. And for many newspapers around the country, then the government became the source of information. Now, after the war, many of these writers for the Committee on Public Information admitted that they had routinely lied or exaggerated to the American public, that they had manufactured victories for the Allies, that they had made up atrocities by the Germans. I think these propaganda posters are, they're still iconic for us. Students still respond to them. So let's take a look at those and think about how we might talk to students about them. The most obvious and one, I think, would be Uncle Sam. Why does that work? I mean, maybe we could think about how the students would respond to this. Why is it that this has remained for us such a powerful image? And how does it? I mean, it's easy for us. I think we've seen it so often that we don't understand why that would be so effective. One of the things I talk to students about in that regard is the idea of the United States, of the country as a family. So the fact that here is an uncle, a stern uncle, sometimes a kindly uncle, has a powerful impulse. And along with that comes the threat to the family. The flip side of this image of a grand family is the external threat. Here, one of the great propaganda victories for the Allied side was the use of the word Hun as a way to define the Germans, describing them as non-Western, Asiatic, even bestial. All effective war propaganda makes this move to try to dehumanize the enemy. If America becomes a family united under Uncle Sam, then it's the beast who's attacking, threatening the family, and very, very often threatening women and children.
Okay, Ernie, we're getting some comments here about the posters. Maybe we could just stop for a moment and ask people if we could go back to the Uncle Sam poster and just ask people to analyze that image a little bit. Ernie asked, what is it that makes that so effective? Can we hear some comments from you out there? A number of you have said it's a direct appeal. What about the visual aspects of it? And what questions might you ask your students to elicit some critical responses about it? He's a wise forefather. He's patriotic looking, piercing eyes. Yeah, very commanding, scornful face. Ernie, one of the participants asked, was this the first appearance of Uncle Sam, or had he been in our national iconography before?
This is the first, and this is actually the artist himself, Montgomery Flagg, who was a fashion artist, who he used his own face, sort of drew himself into history in this way.
He sure did.
This is the first personification of this character, Uncle Sam, I believe.
Yeah, we had a number of people pointing about the very direct address and that finger coming out of the frame, pointing at you. He's got a goatee. Did the artist himself have a goatee, or was that a distinctive feature that he added? Do you know?
I think he had one. I don't know if it was quite so elegantly long as that, but
yeah. Okay, well, could we go on to the next one?
Let's look at some more of these. Here, people who are studying the power of propaganda afterward, trying to figure out why these things work. And here's another. There are a number of images like this. I'll just have one here for you. What propaganda analysts call a false connection. And here, the connection here is that the American troops going to Europe are the equivalent of crusaders going to defend the faith in the Holy Land. The idea is that in propaganda posters, that you take a symbol that already carries with it enormous authority and respect, some powerful emotional associations, and you link those things up without needing to explain exactly. If you had to stop and explain in what way Pershing's army was like the Crusaders, the analogy would break down. But you put it together in a visual image, and that works. Gender is an enormously powerful motivating force, particularly if you're trying to get young men to take an interest in the war. And so a lot of these do the same thing that we saw with the idea of the rape of Belgium, and that is that the message here is that any real man would get involved in this fight. That this isn't a fight that has about geopolitics or defending something like neutral rights of shipping. This is an attack on women and children, and that a real man would get into the fight.
Okay.
Here we see, I think, a similar image of sort of the individual who's holding back, perhaps a little effeminate, a bit of a dandy, and outside is the group in the sunshine with the flag, pushing people to make a choice.
Uncle Sam again.
Uncle Sam, and in this case, the woman, the mother, turning over the son to the cause. As I said, a lot of George Creel had a great eye for artists, and he hired really some of the very best fashion artists out of the fashion magazines to make these some of these posters, and they're still quite beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Now, can we go back to that one, the last one, for a moment?
Sure.
Now, you'd mentioned the use of gender stereotypes in here. Was this a kind of risque image for the early part of the 20th century? Are we getting a little sex sells here?
Sure. Yes, I think it is. It certainly does catch your attention, doesn't it?
Yep. Does that even today, I suppose. Now, the artist here, we have a question. The artist is George Creel.
No, that Creel is the coordinator of
the.
Oh, I don't know the artist of this particular one. I don't have the citation here. I'm not sure whether that's. I can easily check that, but I don't know which one this is.
And we have a question about the cross. Now, this is a poster for the Red Cross, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So hence the Red Cross there in the poster. Did the progressives find any contradiction in the fact that they were using emotional appeals like this? Because, of course, you mentioned that they believed very much in rationality.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to say a little bit about that, but I think that's absolutely right. This is, on the one hand, what we see here is some people saw that this sort of powerful propaganda, this sort of advertising, what George Creel said, this is advertising America. This is taking the tools of mass communication and using them toward this noble national public goal. And that this was an exciting way to rally public support. A country, our democracy's always been struggling over its diversity and its divisions. And propaganda looked like a way to unite people. So in that regard, this looks like a good progressive solution. This is the idea of publicity. But others suggested that this is an ominous development, right? That this is the way to bypass reason and rationality and appeal directly to people's deepest emotions, and that this, in a sense, is a violation of the progressive faith and rationality. So you can really read it both ways. The anxiety, let me see a couple more of these.
Well, if we go back to that one for a moment, we have some discussion about that one here. Is this poster trying to attract women to join the Red Cross or men? And we have some interesting comments here. One participant has linked this poster to the idea of Republican motherhood. I think a really interesting connection.
Sure, and right. This is, if Uncle Sam personifies the male version of this is a variation on this Lady Liberty idea. Through the 19th century, Lady Liberty portrayed in these sorts of flowing gowns. This looks a little more modern and a little more risque than those earlier 19th century images. but yes, this is appealing, making participation by women in the Red Cross to be both patriotic and also attractive.
Oh, okay. So it works two ways there. They're looking to women. See, my another participant writes, my grandfather has told me that the women in blue was the reason he joined up. I guess the woman in the sailor suit earlier, and he served on the USS Illinois in World War I. Yeah, she was pretty cute in her little sailor suit.
Yeah.
Not entirely sure she'd propel me to join the Navy, but she was certainly cute.
Indeed.
Okay, well, shall we go? Shall we go on then?
Another thing that we, I think, can find in these posters that it's worthwhile to share with students here is a sort of visual equivalent of that anxiety about loyalty in the country that we saw right from the start when Wilson is urging people not to express their old world loyalties, but to stay true to America. So a number of these images here are trying to get all of these divided ethnic groups to think of themselves ultimately as Americans. This is a progressive goal that's been going on since the great wave of immigration begins in the 1880s and 1890s. Back to Jane Addams and so forth. A lot of efforts to try to figure out ways to make sure that these people understand and American values, and the war is a way to sort of to push this idea on ethnic groups.
Mm-hmm. If we could go back to that last one for a moment, Ernie, I think
Sure.
it's worthwhile to point out the list of names there. French, Anglo-Saxon, Irish, Slavic, German, Greek, Italian, Jewish, Russian, Polish, Scandinavian, Hispanic. That's they're really trying to incorporate all of the different ethnic groups.
Yes.
And we have a question here, honor roll. We see there beneath that gold star honor roll. Would these be, supposedly the names of men who've died in the war?
I believe with the gold star,
yeah.
That's what that's meant to suggest. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, contribute to the Liberty Loan Drive is another way to express support.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any comments or questions from our participants about these posters? Some of you have said that you use them in your classes. We have a question here. Is the top name talking about W.E.B. Du Bois? Probably not. Probably not.
Yeah, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. But do many of you use these with your posters? And how do your students respond to them? Are they good teaching tools? You can respond to that while we move ahead. Ernie, shall we go on?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about how these things worked. There is a dark side to these, as beautiful as they are, and that is that many, at least, look to these and suggested that these stirred up a sort of American chauvinism and an anti-German sentiment that was really quite remarkable. We see here a minister who's passing on some of the atrocity stories that were marketed by the British and then by the Committee on Public Information. Wilson had promised that this was going to be a high-minded war, a war not against the German people, but the hatred really swelled up under the pressures of war and the pressures of this propaganda campaign. And here are just a few examples of the sort of things that started to happen around the country. Remember, this is a country that's very ambivalent, a lot of people neutral, and the government policy was not to be too invested in this war, not to be critical of and hateful toward the Germans. And suddenly you get this. Ministers in Los Angeles who are leading an anti-war meeting are beaten by an angry mob, and then the police arrest them for inciting violence. In Ohio, another minister is preaching against the war, and he's kidnapped, taken out into the woods, beaten, and left naked. In many universities, professors were fired for expressing their disagreement with the war. German immigrants in many places around the country were beaten, were ridiculed, were forced to buy war bonds at the point of violence, and at least in one case were lynched. In 14 states, classes in German language and culture were dropped from schools. At the City University of New York, you could take German language, but you could only get 2 credits instead of 3 for it. And this is the period where, as you know, we often talk about the assault on German names, the attempt to sort of de-Germanize American culture. So Frankfurters became hot dogs, sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, dachshunds became Liberty dogs, and German measles became Liberty measles. Presses stormed into German language newspapers. There was a vibrant press, immigrant press in the German language, and many of these presses were looted and closed down. Partly this is a result of hysteria stirred up by this pro-war propaganda campaign, and the government actually, while it often claimed not to be encouraging this, actually had done that. The federal attorney general urged citizens across the country to keep an eye on their neighbors, to report any suspicious activity, and even deputized private vigilante groups, treating them as sort of extensions of the Justice Department, to go out and spy on their neighbors and make sure that they were being sufficiently supported. So all of these things seem to support Randolph Thorn's view that no matter how high-minded you are when you go into a war, that these sort of anti-democratic forces, you know, the mad elephant starts to take over, and it doesn't matter whether you're on top or on the bottom, you're not going to stop that mad elephant. Another side of this is what we've talked about. I've called expression, but let's turn now to talk about repression, about the government policy, not simply to be the loudest voice in the marketplace of ideas, but also to silence those who are saying unpopular things. The key to this, and this is an act passed right after Wilson declares war. One of the first things that the Congress does is to pass the Espionage Act. This is an act that, on the face of it, sounds like it's going after German spies, and there certainly were German spies. But the Espionage Act never manages to be used to just catch a single one of them. Instead, it's used to arrest over 2,000 anti-war dissenters. The key here in this very elaborate long act is this one: whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the U.S., is sentenced to a very serious, possible 20-year prison sentence. So this is the tool that the government uses to silence anti-war protesters, those who refused when Wilson suggested the country should go to war. This is the tool for getting people in line. Any attempt as a result of this to protest against the draft and ultimately to criticize the war effort were punishable by imprisonment. The Espionage Act means targets people who can be where you can prove that they are trying to stop people from the draft. The Sedition Act, the year later, goes even further, and listen to this language. It makes it illegal to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. war effort, the Constitution, the flag, or the military uniform. So just about any speech that could be labeled un-American in any way faces the possibility of 20 years in prison. The government in this act also claimed the right to deny the use of the mail for any publication that didn't support the war effort, so that magazines like The Masses, here's a cartoon from The Masses, running a cartoon like this would be enough to allow the post office to deny mailing privileges to the magazine. And essentially, the argument here is that the government made is, we're not stopping this editor from publishing this. He can go ahead and publish it. We're just not going to allow it to go through the mail. And the effect of that, however, was to bankrupt the anti-war press, the German-American press, as well as the radical press. The target, particularly here, were the radicals, the Socialist Party, which was quite large at the time, and they gather together in St. Louis just immediately after Wilson declares war, and in a sense they declare a war of their own. They say this in St. Louis: "We brand a declaration of war by our government as a crime against the people of the United States and against the nations of the world, and we pledge to continuous, active, and public opposition to the war." So the socialists, who are a significant third-party presence in the country, are committing themselves to doing everything they can to criticize the war. Their argument was that this is an imperial war, that this is a war about profits, that the Germans and the British are colonial powers that are really just battling over world markets and resources, and that the United States is only getting into the war in order to protect the loans and the money that it's invested on the Allied side. So this is the socialist position, and they loudly proclaim this until they start to get rounded up and sent to prison for saying that sort of thing.
Ernie, let me ask you about the socialists. Yeah. What was the ethnic makeup of the Socialist Party? Was there one ethnic group that tended to dominate, or was it an amalgam?
Yeah, good question. It was a powerful national party. When Debs, we see Eugene Debs, the socialist leader here, when he ran for president in 1912, he got 6% of the vote. And this was a national vote. There was a strong support for socialists in the South, particularly in Texas and Oklahoma, among sort of radicalized farmers. There was a strong contingent of German immigrants in places like Milwaukee, who were supportive of the socialists. There were Jews on the east side of New York, garment makers, unions, and so forth, who were also supportive. And then the sort of radical bohemian Greenwich Village types also were members of the Socialist Party. So it was a significant, not a major player about to be elected, but rather a significant third-party force, and well organized with a massive press, and lots of speakers, very effective at stump speeches, and a real threat the government felt to the war effort because they had devoted themselves. So there's Eugene Debs, who is the leader. He grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana. What made him such a powerful, charismatic leader was that he was a socialist in the American grain. Some of these socialists had imported their ideas from European socialism, but for Debs, he saw socialism as sort of the next step in the evolution of American democracy. He said, in the same way that the abolitionists had fought to overthrow chattel slavery in the mid-19th century, that the big issue in the early 20th century was wage slavery, and that socialists were going to fight against a government that had essentially been corrupted by capitalism. So their goal was to overthrow capitalism and in the name of reasserting democracy. And for Debs, Debs was able to talk about this and in the same breath talk about Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine and John Brown and Walt Whitman and so forth. And so he built a significant Americanized audience, as well as appealing to the immigrant groups to hold this party together. So here's Debs giving his speech, and here's what he says in this speech. He makes this speech in Canton, Ohio, in 1918. He knows that the government is in the audience. Stenographers are taking down his every word. He knows that many of his colleagues, his comrades, have already gone to prison, and that he may well go to prison if he's not careful. And he says this, he says, the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It's the ruling class that invariably does both. You need to know that you're fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. For saying this, Debs was arrested and faced the prospect of a long prison sentence. He was in his mid-60s, in not good health, and really, was facing the possibility of dying in prison for this. Debs was in court in Cleveland in September of 1918, and he was totally unrepentant. Admitted that he had said this, and essentially tried to turn the tables and put the law itself on trial. His argument was that he was doing just what he had every right to do, which was to speak out on an important public issue. And he finishes this speech with these words that are often quoted from Debs: "While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Debs, at this trial, lays out an argument for free speech that resonated at the time and resonates still. He said that down through history, that progress is always advanced by a small and courageous minority, people who are willing to stand up against the system and demand change. He reminded the jury and the national audience that Jefferson had been a revolutionary, that the abolitionists, when they first started to agitate against slavery, were despised. They were denied the right to free speech. They were brutalized. And Debs said the socialists are, in a sense, the same way. They're part of this, the next step in the evolution of American democracy. And while they're being persecuted now, ultimately they'll be vindicated by history. Now, those arguments, as eloquent as they were, didn't make any impact on the judge and the jury. They quickly convicted Debs and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. A few months later, this conviction goes up all the way up to the Supreme Court to see whether or not the Espionage Act is constitutional. And many Americans who at that point were feeling like the Wilson administration had gone too far were eager to use this opportunity to pull back and to overturn the Espionage Act. But the Supreme Court unanimously upholds it, rather than taking on the Debs case directly, which was the most high-profile one. The court took on a related case right at the same time of a less well-known socialist who was accused of passing out anti-draft pamphlets, a man named Schenck. And here's where that famous phrase, "a clear and present danger," comes into the legal vocabulary and to our culture. Oliver Wendell Holmes, extremely articulate Supreme Court justice, writes this important speech. But in here, Holmes makes this argument. He's basically saying free speech means one thing in times of war and another thing in times of peace. The closing lines here: "When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in times of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right." When the U.S. puts troops in danger, Holmes argues, commits them to war, Congress has a right to protect their safety in any way that it sees necessary, even if that means ignoring free speech rights that everybody would recognize in times of peace. Now, many would go back, and this is worth talking to the students about, this idea of a clear and present danger, which Holmes lays out. Many would suggest that whatever else you might think about Eugene Debs and socialism and about his speech to a socialist picnic, that it really didn't threaten the country in any sort of clear and present way. You know, that the danger, if there was a danger, was certainly not immediate. But Holmes is part of a unanimous court that sends Debs off to prison.
Did anybody,
yeah.
a question, did anybody try to define the term substantive evils? Because that's hugely vague.
Yeah.
I mean, what would be a substantive evil? Did anybody try to define that?
the key seems to be whether or not the focus has been much more on this issue of clear and present, whether the danger, whatever it might be, is about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see this sort of evolves a little bit in a subsequent case where this is picked up again.
I see. So they're
right. What the danger is. I guess whether the danger is clear gets a little bit at the substantive question as well.
Yeah. So they don't make any distinctions among dangers. I mean, you can have a danger that is minor, then you can have one that is going to threaten to overturn the country. So that was left to I guess law enforcement people to determine, right? That's right.
Although clearly, Holmes is not setting the bar all that low. I mean, he is suggesting that this is something where it seems to me that the logic of this is that if people believe that it threatens the country at a moment of crisis, Congress has a right to step in. Of course, in a time of crisis, people don't make very clear decisions about what's threatening and what isn't. That's the issue here.
Okay.
So as the war ends and Debs goes off to prison, some in the public are deeply disturbed by what they've seen. This story that I've just told you about the expansion of violence against ethnic groups, the use of federal power to silence people who are clearly, speaking out on a major public issue, sending them to jail. And so they start to organize a protest movement against putting these dissenters in jail. There are about 1,200 anti-war speakers. Debs is the most famous, but there are 1,200 others joining him in jail. Emma Goldman is in jail, for example. So these people start to organize a protest movement, and the best known part of this, and I think the one that if we're thinking about what we want our students to know about the results of World War I, I think one of them that's important to know about is this is where the American Civil Liberties Union comes from. They are part of this organized movement, small group of liberals and radicals and some conservatives who are organizing. Their first project is to try to get people like Debs out of prison. Here we see a petition gathered by the socialists on its way to the White House, American people arguing about whether or not people like Debs ought to be in prison. Here's another protest on behalf of the political prisoners in front of the White House. This campaign's most successful strategies was to run Debs for president while he's sitting in prison, convict 9653. And Wilson had suggested the election of 1920 ought to be a referendum about his ideas for a League of Nations. But the socialists said, no, this should really be a referendum about free speech. This is an opportunity. By voting for Debs, whether you like socialism or not, this is a chance to wage a protest vote about the expansion of federal power during the war. Now, not everybody sympathized with Debs. The American Legion, organizing in this time period for the first time, organizes to keep Debs in prison, lobbies the White House. The Ku Klux Klan considered this to be one of their important agenda items, was to protest against the possibility of letting Debs out of prison. The Klan and the Legion both broke up meetings and parades pushing for amnesty for these people. They smashed printing presses and even kidnapped some socialist speakers. Others suggested at the time that I'll go back to. Some others suggested that Debs belonged in prison, that he had made his argument against the government, and he was getting what he deserved, and essentially he was an enemy of the Constitution at a time of crisis, and therefore he could expect no protection from the law. After much pressure and argument, Woodrow Wilson decides not to let Debs out of prison. He ends his last day in office by saying that he's not going to do this, that he has an obligation to the families of those who died in the war not to let Debs out. But by 1921, as Warren Harding, the Republican, is coming in for letting Debs and others out of jail is growing, people had different reasons for wanting Debs out of jail. Some said that it was fine to put him in jail during the war, but that a 10-year sentence was excessive, that as soon as the war was over, they should let bygones be bygones and let him out. And others said this was a crucial misstep. This was by the government to expand its power in an area where it should never have done that. So this was the worst thing. Many Americans, the socialists have been right. The war had to.
Ernie, the sound is breaking up again. If we could just stop for a moment and let the signal catch up with us. Okay, let's try it again.
Okay.
Well, the sound doesn't want to catch up to us this time. Let me see if let me just see what I can do here. Let's see. I'm sorry about this, folks. Technology is great when it works, and when it doesn't work,
you sound a little clearer to me now. How does that?
Okay, I think it's come back. All right, so let's continue. If you could repeat, go back to where you started with this image, and I think we'll take it from there.
Okay. Many Americans were, by 1920, 21, becoming disillusioned with the war. Many people started to think the way the socialists had, that the war itself was being fought for profits rather than for democracy. Especially when Wilson's idea about a League of Nations was defeated. So it looks as if the socialists had been right all along. And here we see a cartoon where somebody who has made fat profits on the war is on the outside in a limousine, where somebody who is clearly Eugene Debs is still on the inside. And people started to say, well, maybe it's true that socialists had been silenced, not because they actually threatened the war effort, but because they had said harsh things about big business. In 1919, many had been worried about the threat of revolutionary radicalism in the country. People who were worried about the Germans suddenly became worried about communists. This inspired Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to conduct his raids, rounding up and deporting radicals. But once people saw the results of this, it became clear that he had turned up very little evidence of any sort of danger to the country, that he had exaggerated the dangers, and that he had clearly violated the rights of many people, arrested and deported many who had been guilty of no crime at all. So there was a real backlash here, which I think is very important, against the expansion of government power. Progressive reformers going into the war wanted a stronger, more active federal government. But in the early 20s, they started to realize that what they actually wanted was a strong government, but also very strong protections for freedom of speech and for political dissent. And that maybe Randolph Thorn had been right, that it's impossible to wage a war along progressive, rational, reasonable lines, that sort of the dark forces of greed and fear are always going to be stirred up in wartime. So this decision to send Debs and others to jail came under mounting criticism, and it was really the start of the discussion that we still have today about our right to free speech in times of war, and about the dangers of war and the expansion of executive power that makes possible. And this conversation, as I said, produced the American Civil Liberties Union, and it also, 6 months later, produced a powerful change in direction for none other than Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, and remember, we had seen this slide of his position on the Schenck case, where essentially he's saying the government was okay to send these people to jail. 6 months later, he takes up a very similar case in terms of the facts, but as a dissenter, as the lone dissenter in this particular case, completely changes his direction and makes one of the most impassioned defenses of free speech in the court's history. He says this, and this is often quoted, and I think worth getting your students to clip out and put under their pillows. When men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe, even more than they believe the very foundation of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. It's an experiment, as all life is an experiment. Here, Holmes goes back to this idea of clear and present danger, and in this time uses it as an argument to not put Abrams in prison. He says, only put people in prison when what they're doing imminently threatens immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law. It's another way of saying clear and present danger, but in a much more focused and stronger way. Holmes, when he does this, is the only person in the court as a dissenting voice, but by the 1930s, this argument is so compelling that it becomes the law of the land, and this is really one of the most important outcomes of this story, I think, is the shift. I think it's important for students not just to see World War I as this strange moment when the government went overboard with the Red Scare, with the violence against immigrants, but rather to see this as the beginning of a very important conversation about the limits of federal power and the importance of civil liberties that continue to evolve over the course of the 20th century. And the fact that, you know, your students and you and I can stand on a street corner and protest against a war without threat of being arrested or torn off a soapbox by an angry mob really links back to this defining moment, I think. One final image. Finally, it was the conservative Republican Warren Harding, who really was no friend of socialists, who makes the decision to let Debs out of jail on Christmas morning of 1921. Harding never admitted that the government had overreached, and never admitted that it was wrong to put Debs in prison. But as part of his program to restore the country to what he called normalcy, he released most of the wartime prisoners. He allowed radical newspapers to go back to using the post office to mail their subscriptions, and he stopped the government surveillance and interference with various ethnic groups and political groups. So this might be, I think, the thing that we need, is most relevant. This question we started with about how do you make World War I relevant and interesting. I think the way to do that is to talk about what happens when the country goes to a total war, sort of pressures that this puts on democracy. Even in a case like this, where the country is supposedly fighting to make the world safe for democracy. But this produces a reaction, the beginnings of a commitment to free speech that's stayed with us down to our own time. And I think I'll stop there and see, Richard, if there are more questions or things that I didn't get a chance to talk about that we should talk about.
Okay, we do have some questions. One question came up earlier. What was Debs's attitude toward the soldiers fighting the war? Was he critical of them, or was he pretty sympathetic toward them?
He was sympathetic. He would argue that they were themselves victims, that essentially, the phrase "rich man's war, poor man's fight," that the soldiers were essentially being forced to fight a war that was not protecting their interests. To the extent that soldiers were enthusiastic and supportive of the war, he felt that they were misunderstanding what the war was really about. But his target was absolutely on business leaders, and in his view, business leaders were calling the shots, and people like Wilson people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, the courts, and so forth were all really doing the bidding of big business, and that the average worker really was, misunderstood what was going on if he thought that he had a democratic voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in this narrative, triumph of socialism doesn't exactly triumph, but people tend to absorb the lessons of socialism. As you said, they begin to think that the socialists might have been right about some things. But does World War I mark the high water of socialism in America? Did it wane after World War I?
Absolutely. And it did for several reasons. One is this persecution. The socialist leaders ended up in jail. The party was bankrupted. The press was essentially just about wiped out. Another part of that story, though, is that for many of these socialists, they looked at what was going on in Russia and decided that the Bolsheviks were the way forward. Debs himself refused to become a communist. Thought that the Bolsheviks were not Democrats. He thought that they may have used methods that were necessary in order to overthrow the tyranny of the Tsar, but that was not appropriate in America. Mm-hmm. But a lot of socialists said, "Look, look what the government will do to us if we stand up against it. We don't have rights here, so we're better off promoting a communist revolution." So that really split the socialists, and they never were really an important force. Many of their ideas, a lot of the social safety network that we think of as part of the Progressive Party, and ultimately became part of the New Deal, all of these things are laid out in the Socialist Party platform. So a lot of like a lot of third parties, they raised issues, they pushed the conversation in a particular direction, and then having accomplished that, they disappeared off the stage.
Right. Now, you said that the end of World War I marked a good deal of skepticism about progressivism and its goals. But would you comment on the League of Nations as a progressive organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. Wilson, saw this as the ultimate solution. This was going to solve on a foreign policy level all of the problems that had caused the war, and it was a perfect expression of the progressive commitment to self-determination, to democracy, to open and deliberate debate, and to nonviolence through a sort of collective security agreement.
Mm-hmm. So that enshrined a lot of progressive values.
Absolutely, absolutely. But many suggested that Wilson had done such a good job of smashing people to the left of him during the war, and that so much had happened during the war that discouraged progressives about the cause, that this helped to contribute to the conservative, more nationalist direction of the country by 1920. And clearly, Harding plays up on this, that the progressives had interfered too much in people's lives, not just with free speech, but it interfered in the government. That its ideas for world peace were only going to drag the country into another frustrating war, and better to step back from that. So this really was both the high watermark of progressive ideas during World War I, a chance to test these out on a massive scale, but it also revealed some of the flaws and limitations and introduced a backlash, so that many historians suggest this is the swan song, the death of the Progressive Party, progressive movement in this period.
And we have one. Let's make this one the final question here. A good question. In retrospect, what are the lessons the U.S. didn't learn that we should have during World War I? Any particular lessons we didn't learn from that war?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think many would suggest if you look at the how late the U.S. entered into World War II, many would suggest that what happened was that Americans became so skeptical about atrocity stories that when Hitler started to rise in Germany and stories started to circulate about what he was doing to the Jews, many Americans decided they'd heard that before. They knew about the rape of Belgium. They knew it was a bunch of lies. And they also knew not to get involved. So they passed neutrality acts, which made it impossible to support our allies when the war began to develop in the 30s. So the end result was it took us a very, very long time, perhaps dangerously close to not in time, to fight fascism because we, in a sense, maybe misapplied or over-applied what we thought were the lessons of World War I. Mm-hmm. There's definitely a direct link there.
Okay. Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 8:30. We've come to the end of our seminar. Any final questions or comments before we wrap things up for this evening? Okay, I don't see any coming into the chat, so ladies and gentlemen, let me say that we hope you'll use the forum to continue the discussion. We'll monitor the forum until December 4th, which means that if there are any questions or comments that appear that we should send on to Ernie, we will. We'll get back to you. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for your participation this evening, and I want to thank Ernie for giving us a very interesting and provocative seminar. I had never really made the connections between World War I and progressivism. I hope our teachers learned something tonight. I certainly did, that's for sure. So thank you, Ernie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Well, great. And ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to take a look at our spring seminar schedule. You can find that on the America in Class webpage. And I want to remind you to please submit your evaluations. Those mean a great deal to us. And join us again. Let me see when our next Osceola seminar is here. I have it on my sheet. Let me rifle through here and find out when it is. It's on January 15th. We'll be looking at FSA photographs from the 1930s. That's an excellent seminar. I think you'll enjoy it. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation this evening, and we will see you in January. Take care, and have a good Thanksgiving holiday and a good winter holiday as well. Good evening.